Well, good evening, everyone. Peter, thank you very much for the introduction. The diagram that you put up a moment ago, you'd be pleased to know all my presentation looks like that. So I'll be testing your eyesight by the end of the presentation of how much you can read. I'm very honoured to have been asked to give this Alexander von Humboldt lecture. And when I was asked to give it, I had in mind von Humboldt's background and oeuvre in terms of scientific discoveries, his enthusiasm for travel, his interdisciplinary, holistic perspective of geography and life. And my talk this evening attempts to combine different elements. It attempts to combine geography with planning and with politics in a multidisciplinary way. Peter made reference to my degree background, which is unusual perhaps, of planning, geography, political science and film history especially. And my work over the last few years has been trying increasingly to bridge different subjects, to look at the gaps between different disciplines, to find new areas of discovery. And that's what this talk is about today. It's about looking in a multidisciplinary way at long-term challenges, the sorts of issues that you will have to contend with when you're my age or even older, as well as looking at more immediate concerns about the present day. Concerns, as we all know, about the future of the economy, about climate change, about population increases, about lack of food, and so on. And I'm going to bombard you with a series of images. I've got a few word-based slides, but predominantly it's all image-based. And those illustrations are meant to summarize, if you like, the issues that we are having to face up to. And I want you to look at those images and what they're supposed to represent. But also, I want you to look at each image as it affects every other issue. So don't just look at it in a myopic, single way. Look at the transport slide, for instance, but look at it in terms of the users of transport on the environment, on the economy, on land. And build up this very rich picture of, instead of looking at things in a silo mentality, you look at things in a synoptic way. And only when you do that do you begin to discover things that you hadn't seen before. And that's the beauty of doing interdisciplinary research. You find the areas between the areas that you're normally concerned with to unlock something quite new. It's not easy, I can say this. You only have to look at the lines on my face to realize it is not an easy process at all. But ultimately, it's a very rewarding one. So my perspective as a geographer, planner, political scientist, stroke, film historian, whatever, is that we can only make sense of the drivers of change as they affect land, as they affect quality of life, by taking a long-term synoptic interdisciplinary perspective. And that's not without its challenge, as I said. And I'll be referring to these things in a global context. These things are common across different nations, but I will use the examples from the UK and the report, the research report that Peter mentioned a moment ago. So let's start off. These are the core structure of the talk. I'll say a bit about some ideas about the future, including sustainability and resilience. Won't concentrate too much on theory. I'll go on to look at what's changing and what is likely to change, not look into a crystal ball to imagine what the future is going to look like as a prediction, but look at what's changing, where are the ebbs and flows about the things that we are trying to deal with, manage on a day-to-day basis. I'll talk a bit for those who are really obsessed about methodologies and research. I'll talk a bit about the methodological challenges and disciplinary challenges of working between subjects as well. I'll then present the evidence that we came up with in the report, and then try, if you haven't got a headache by that stage, of making sense of it all and seeing where we might go in the future for research terms. Okay, the three questions that I have set, and I've set myself, for the next few years are these. How much land do we need now and in the future to meet all our requirements? Okay. We expect the land to provide everything. It just doesn't just provide these sorts of buildings, office accommodation, housing, railway stations, bits of infrastructure. Land provides water, energy, food, biodiversity, and is a site for our waste. And all those competition of uses are brought to bear on individual parcels of land, which means that there is contestation continuously about the appropriate use of land. And while that's going on, while the arguments rage over what happens to individual buildings and individual plots of land, so we expect the state, the planning process, landowners to deliver everything. We want it all. How do we plan for that in the future? How do we recognize that that's what's going on? Do we have this synoptic knowledge of the cumulative effects of change? So by making a critical decision here now about an individual building, its future, or a plot of land, what are the long-term domino effect that's created for neighbouring land uses, or the services that we rely on long-term? Where's the tipping point which says we shouldn't do this now because it will have an implication for the delivery of resources or quality of life that people expect for the future? And then finally, how do we manage these processes? And I say this as a planner, but essentially a lot of our spatial planning processes are archaic. Archaic in the sense that they're not fit for purpose for the long-term thinking that we need to start looking at. I'll pad these out in more detail as we go along. Let's look at some ideas about the future and the fact that we want it all. Some basic, quick-fire bullet points. How do we meet our national and subnational needs against a global backdrop, particularly in the context of the European Union? The European Commission has certain agendas, individual member states has its agendas, and cities and regions within each country has its agendas as well. And that's a balancing act. But also there's the balance between national and sub-regional with local and community and neighbourhood desires, and sometimes there are tensions that occur there. We also need to balance environmental issues with economic gain. And you only have to pick up newspapers, read the news to identify that that's an ongoing story between meeting short-term economic growth agendas that will create jobs, but maybe at the expense, sustainably, of environmental issues. How do we ensure that infrastructure is renewed and it's tied to development phasing, and in what order that occurs? And certainly in the UK, that isn't a good success story at all. We put in the development and then think about the infrastructure afterwards. How do we think about master planning and fast decision making? If companies, developers want quick access to land and development, they want quick response times, well, how does that chime with issues about long-term perspectives? Dealing with the present needs, but also thinking about long-term issues. Mediating between conflicting users. Everyone has an opinion, even if you're not a landowner, everyone has an opinion about what happens to land and space, while allowing more pluralist forms of participation, more people getting involved with decision making. So what is the role between the state and public sector planners, for example, and those people out there who are the users or beneficiaries of planning decisions? And how are those people brought into the process? If you're taking a long-term perspective, but the public are interested in the here and now, how do you bring that in to the management process as well? It's about protecting the past, perhaps not all of it we want to keep, but also it's about looking at the future as well. And there's another dualism there, a tension. And then finally, all this is done through negotiation, even on individual sites. Not always the case in some countries, but certainly mostly it's about the policy process, interpretation. And a lot can happen which is unforeseen, not just foreseeable. So those are we want it all and we want it all now, and everyone has a voice in the system, and how do we balance that? There's been a lot written about sustainability, and this has been a convenient label over the last 30 to 40 years, for that national governments can say, we are behaving sustainably because we're taking all these things into account. And that is an interesting issue. It's taking these things into account. Doesn't mean to say that politicians are acting sustainably, but they're ticking the box and saying, we are behaving sustainably because we're taking into account all these different interests and all these different dualisms. Not necessarily so. And the more it's been politically adopted, the more it's been changed. It's been malleable. It's been misshaped into something which sounds political rhetoric, in that sustainability is about economic growth, it's about environmental protection, and it's social inclusion. And depending on which side you're talking to government, if you're in one of those groups, then they will say to you, we are doing something about economic growth. We are doing something about social inclusion. We are dealing with environmental protection, therefore we are sustainable. That's not necessarily the case, as I say. And I just wonder now whether the sustainable development, because it means everything to everyone, it's getting to the stage where it's been politically appropriated. It's been overused. It's been manipulated to the point it can mean anything you want it to mean. And when that happens politically, you know it's damaged goods. Something isn't working. The intention behind it is being lost, and it's being managed in a political way. There's a good example of this in the UK, where there's a myth in UK government circles that if you add up all the UK government's policies which have a land take, needs the land in some way, then the UK government thinks the UK is 3 times bigger than it actually is. And that says, if you look at the policy documents, you can have it all. Well, unless we start reclaiming land from the North Sea, a bit difficult in the UK's case, as opposed to on this side of the continent, then that is not achievable. So do governments really believe they can achieve win-win-win outcomes while avoiding decisions with these long-term implications? And I wonder whether it's a sign perhaps of the appropriation issue, the damaged good issue with sustainable development as a phrase, that academia has started to talk more recently about resilience rather than sustainability. The resilient city, the resilient region, the degree to which cities and regions can pick up after turmoil, after crises, and carry on. There's a poster that's very popular in the UK, keep calm and carry on. And that, if you like, relates to resilience quite well. We can deal with economic crisis, and we can come through it, and we made of sterner stuff. We can deal with climate change, we can deal with flooding, we can deal with rising sea level, and we can carry on. And that seems to suggest that resilience is this very populist movement at the time. But look out for the politicians when they find this and see what happens to it. The issue is, if you take a synoptic, global perspective, a big perspective of all these cumulative effects, how they all interact against each other, then if you look at our existing theories and concepts, then you scratch your head and say, actually, none of these are appropriate. You're talking about lots of different dualisms faced in lots of different ways. You're talking about different constituency interests. You're dealing with much long-term perspectives, 50, 60 years' time. What theories exist in planning, geography, environmental politics that help us with this understanding? We can choose a range of different theories that apply. You could look at collaborative planning to deal with participation. You could look at institutionalism to deal with governments. But really, how can they be brought together if you take in this long-term perspective? The sort of things I'm sure you're used to in looking at essays and dissertations. In terms of the drivers of change, these are the things that are going on that we need to try and make sense of. And these are not always recognized, even within government. I say this as a former government advisor. Government doesn't always recognize these things are actually going on. We know about planned global change, such as climate change. We know about demographic shifts and population increases in some parts of the world. We know about economic decline and unevenness as well. We look at our governmental processes, and we say, are they fit for purpose? Can they cope with change? And politicians want to be seen to be managing and changing the governance and planning processes constantly as a way of saying, we're doing something about this. We have now had the most recent announcement in the UK of the 5th new Planning Act in 8 years. And that's a sign about how politicians want to be seen to be addressing these issues, so change the governmental processes without actually knowing whether they deliver or not. We have a crisis about whether long-term synoptic strategic planning are good things to do. Do we really want to look into a crystal ball and imagine how the world would be in 50 years' time, or should we just deal with it incrementally as it happens? And so the idea that you can stand back and cast your eyes over something long-term, long distance, seems perhaps futile in many ways. So there's a view out there, certainly from some politicians and economists, well, we shouldn't even do it. We shouldn't even do long-term strategic planning because we'll never get to that point. Something else will go along and we'll deal with it by incremental change as it happens. Reliance on the state, a big question mark over the appropriateness of planning to manage these processes, or a reliance on the market, that market is well best placed through a neoliberal argument to address these things, and the state is there to pick up the pieces. And ongoing tensions across Europe at the moment about the role of the state versus the role of the market, and those tensions exacerbating. I said about greater forms of participation. How easy and how genuine is it? When your state, when national government sponsors more pluralism and more participation and greater voices in the system, then on whose terms are we talking? Is it genuine or is it tokenistic? And of course, if you take the common element of all these things, it's about the land. Each nation state has a limited amount of space within which it can maneuver, play chess with the pieces, because the same amount of land is there now as perhaps it always was. And so how it affects well-being and quality of life becomes important. This is one of the last wordy slides, you'll be pleased to know, then we are coming on to the images, honestly. All these things are not new. They're perhaps more severe and perhaps more complex in some cases than they've been before, and more urgent, that's for certain. And there have been responses of how we've dealt with these things in the past. New science, new technology comes along to help us. We have renewable infrastructure in some ways. We have different sustainable consumption patterns, different land ownership patterns, agricultural production. You could look at any of those things on the screen and say, oh, well, there are answers in there somewhere. Someone will come up with responses and answers to these things. And it's not going to be as severe or as problematic over a 50-year timescale as perhaps everyone thinks. And we'll lose some things in the process, no doubt about that, as we've lost in past generations as well. So these tough questions are big issues, but ultimately there will be solutions. And so maybe let things happen as they go along. Let's look at the demands on the land, because if you apply this to issues of key constituent interests, then you realize that we've got major issues that we need addressing. Certainly in individual nations, but across the globe as well. We're a very transient society. Societies move from one country to another. In-migration is causing different cultural permutations in countries. That's causing problems as well. Some new migrants perhaps don't fit into certain societies very well, or don't want to, as the case might be. We might have aging societies where the number of people over 60, 65 are outnumbering the number of young people. That is a major economic issue and social issue in terms of health provision as well. And so how our cities are changing and the people within the cities are something that we need to be concerned about. It's not just about planning and space and place. It goes to the very heart of the issue about service delivery, like education and like health as well. Life expectancy in cities is the greatest than in rural areas, and that's likely to change as well. We expect 1 in 4 people to live to 100 within the next 30 years. Now, that seems very difficult for us to imagine, the number of elderly people on the streets that you have to navigate round. I'll be in that group, by the way, that you're trying to overtake on the pavement. But that seems a major resource issue, a major service issue. And where are they geographically located? If they're in rural areas, how will they have access to rural health emergency services? Will they? So there's a health and life issue associated with these things. And of course, you might have an economically shrinking workforce. So where's your taxation base coming from to invest back into services as well? City, quality. This is artist's illustration of the newly christened Queen Elizabeth Park in London. You will know it as the London 2012 Olympic Park. But essentially, whole issues here about who's benefiting, the quality of life of living within the city, and why the Olympics were located in this part of London, or why this part of the UK for that matter. Who is it benefiting? The quality of life of people living within close proximity to the Olympic Park, the London Borough of Newham and Tower Hamlets, and in Bethnal Green and Hackney, for example. Are they really benefiting from this sort of quality, development-led perspective? Who knows? The suspicions are there, of course. But the quality of space, how we enjoy the quality of space within cities is all going to be affected if more people are in cities, and there's different demographic base to those people as well. We can have quick fix solutions, instant development responses to deal with economic problems, but really, whose long-term interests in cities are we talking about? We could look at impact, certainly from climate change and threatening of rising sea levels, and talk about what that means. But you could also do it in terms of the impact on quality of life and quality of culture. If London floods, then think how many heritage assets will go underwater. Think how many good buildings, architectural and historical interest, will go. It won't take that much long-term thinking, of course. It won't take that much for both the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey to go. Why? Historically, because it's built on an island. So, what nature has given up, nature might reclaim. And think about those assets that we expect to be there all the time, but are they going to be there in the future? We could look at issues about places. By 2030, 5 billion people will live in cities. And so that will make up 81% of urban humanity. Astonishing figure. In Karachi today, there are 18 million people, 20 million in Mexico City, 21 million in Mumbai. And cities are structured around the public realm. We change buildings periodically on a fast recycling exercise. But the spaces between stay constant. And how will places be with that many people crowded into? What are the externalities that we have to face? Movement. Well, we know about tensions between public transport and private transport. We know, for example, that 4 million people try to use the London Underground system every single day. And boy, does it look like it as well. 5 million are using the Underground in Beijing, 11 million in Moscow. China built 420 kilometers of new high-speed railway line in 20 years. So we can do it, but we can do it in a totalitarian regime. Might be more difficult in other societies. And these modal splits between different types of transport means there are issues to be contend with. It was a fact that, of course, in Beijing and in London for the Olympic Games in both cities, Olympic lanes were designated in the road network to allow officials and athletes to speed from hotels to the Olympic site. And in fact, those of us who were working in London during the Olympic Games were told not to go into work because that was the only way that the transport system could cope. If the people who use the transport system normally for their work and commuting, if those people stayed at home, it would allow the tourists and the visitors to get to the Olympic sites. That was the only way that London functioned during the Olympic Games. Now, if you imagine increases in population in these big cities, and that becomes more of a norm rather than an exception, you realize you've got a major management issue to contend with. We know about resources or depleting resources, perhaps in the case of oil and gas. And what alternative sources are there? Nuclear, fission, fusion, coal extract, biofuels, environmental fuels. And I guess all of these are being experimented with to some extent. And all of them might mean that cities consume their own smoke in the future. In other words, cities have to become much more green and rely on their own resources rather than the resources of neighboring nations or neighboring cities. Technology will help us. And this is the more awkward one to deal with because this is the big unknown. If I knew what new forms of technology we will be using in the next 30 years, I guess I would be in Apple now, as opposed to in academia. And those are the guys who know about new technology. I gave a talk about this to students at Imperial College in London who are engineers. And they're arts and engineer students, a strange mix perhaps. And they were interested in the new inventions. What's going to be invented on the back of all this in the next 20 to 30 years. And they say, oh yes, of course we'll be teleporting everywhere. And you go, yeah, right. But to them it's like, oh yes, we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do that. And of course that will change what we do. The very invention of something like a smartphone changes our need for space. We can work anywhere, unfortunately. We can change where we live, where we work, according to this change in technology. And the same will be true of technology. At this present time, 2/3 of all future jobs in 40 years' time are not known. Right? So that is a very bizarre issue to think about, where we don't know the forms of employment in the future or the spatial requirements of them as well. Food is a bit more depressing. As you might guess, 250,000 people are being born every single day in the world. 1 billion people are starving every day in the world. 400 million are chronically malnourished. 11 million children every year are dying from hunger. And the thing is that food production per capita in even 50-odd developing countries has declined. Developed countries has declined in the last 25 to 30 years or so. It takes 30 billion vehicle journeys to transport food around the world. Now, how sustainable is that? And in some cases, developed nations are importing foodstuffs from developing nations, and those nations might need their own foodstuffs in the future to support their own populations. It's no surprise, thanks Joe, it's no surprise perhaps that countries are going in for land grab. China is buying land up in South America and Africa to feed its own country. So what about the nations in South America and Africa as well? Climate change, we know it's happening, but can it be proven? And what are the issues about it? What's the solutions? Urban heat sinks, refracted energies, rise in sea levels, increased prospects of flooding through extreme weather conditions, and so on. And change in temperatures, which will change food production in some countries, including Northern Europe. So things will change, and those things we take for granted at the moment, including certain foodstuffs, might disappear in terms of long-term thinking as well. The economy, well, we know a bit about that as well, boom and bust. But who funds infrastructure? Who funds development in the future? Who funds skills and education as well, and where are the jobs coming from? And if you think about all these things, which means that from a spatial and political, geopolitical point of view, some nations will benefit, others will lose, then what were we going to be left with in a 30 to 50-year timescale if some countries are facing extreme food shortages, or water shortages, or energy shortages? And surely there's a tipping point there in terms of civil order and people going out on the streets to demonstrate what they have been taken for granted so long. We like to say we're green, but how much of a gimmick is it? Can we deliver on these things? So we look at layers of intent. How far can we demonstrate that we're doing all of these things? Can we look at cities and planning processes in a multi-use way rather than a singular-use way? Each plot of land perhaps should demonstrate more than one use, one benefit. It has to be cleverer in the sorts of things that we expect in the future because we want it all and we're not prepared to compromise on those things as well. The question is, of course, how do we do it? So let's look at some of these issues as they apply to one nation. Let's look at the UK only. Current population of the UK for a small country is huge. 62.3 million people live in the UK. And the forecast is, the trend projection is that that will go to 73 million, increase of 10 million in the next 15 to 20 years or so. 25% of the UK live in one corner of the country, London and the southeast. And anyone who's been to London recently will see it, in terms of it being congested. If that 10 million happens, then there's a good scenario to say that the majority of those people will gravitate to London and the southeast. Economically, that's where the jobs are compared to the rest of the country. And so how do we house these people? Where do we house them? What's going to happen physically to the city, as well as the issues about services, housing, health, and so on. Economic issues, well, we know that some regions bounce back. London has bounced back from the double dip, almost triple dip recession that the UK is in currently. But equally, it's starting to gain employment. Public sector jobs have increased in the southeast over the last few years, whereas in the northeast, my region and Joe's region, then we've had a loss of public sector jobs. So there's a clear split, north-south divide economically in the country at the moment. Look at change in environment. I said about food a moment ago. The UK imports 95% of its fruit consumption and 50% of its vegetable consumption from overseas. Not very sustainable. Again, relying on developing nations in some cases for those luxury food items. And flood risks, of course, coming into that as well. Transport and infrastructure. We've sleepwalked into this. Number of cars on UK roads in 1950, cars 2 million, now 31 million, and that's increasing. 27% in people using the railway service since 2003, that number going up and causing congestion as well. 200 million people using the airports in the UK in 2010, and that number expecting to double to 400 million by 2020. Now you can say, oh, there's a clear case here for planning, surely. Yeah, well, we'll come on to that in a moment. Energy, shortage of gas, oil and water. The UK currently relies on France to supply it with electricity at peak times. As 5 million kettles are turned on in UK homes at 8 p.m. on a weekday evening, so the electricity companies are on the phone to France to say, can we have some of your electricity, please? And it sounds a joke, but actually it's true. Mainly because France owns our electricity companies and is connected to the national grid. But on water, the UK will consume an extra 800 million litres of water per day by 2020. So where will this water come from? Find land for housing for this extra population is one thing. Find water supply is another thing altogether. And of course the house builders don't really talk about that issue. Build a house, fine, but if you can't get clean drinking water, then you're back to basics. So regional disparities there. Well, anyway, all this was taxing the minds of government and politicians, and so in 2007-2008, a former minister, David Miliband, who was Environment Minister at the time, asked the chief scientist in the UK to come up with a project which would look at this long-term perspective of how much land we would need. It's called the Foresight Land Use Futures Project. I was one of the 8 different disciplinary experts that was on board with this. The 8 of us actually from 8 different disciplines: planner, geographer, hydrologist, natural resource manager, 2 economists, a transport planner, and a landscape person, and I've probably missed one out as well, economic geographer as well. So all these people come together, use our combined wisdom to try and look at this issue. And boy, did we get a headache looking at this. A very fascinating project, but nevertheless one that caused no end of problems methodologically. We tried to look at the land system as a diagram. So we said, okay, if here are the different drivers of change, environmental, economic, demographic, the sorts of things I've just outlined, and this is the land system with all its different land uses, looks a bit like a magic carpet, then within here, what happens? So the governmental process tries to mediate, the planning process tries to mediate, and then you also have people's behavior, how they behave and what they expect coming into play. And we said, that's the land system, that's all the stuff that goes on there. And we realized, of course, that it was far too simple, that didn't explain it at all. And there it is again, that is the diagram that you need. Now, what this diagram, I don't expect you to see this, but I put it up because this is the complexity of what we're having to deal with in talking about the cities of the future. So these boxes, and you can see them in more detail because I've got CD-ROMs of them, which I'll leave with you. These boxes represent interventions. So if the government intervenes on tax, property tax, for example, then it causes this chain reaction in the rest of the system. Not just about housing and property and land, but about wealth, about the amount of wealth in the system, the impact it has on purchasing power, the impact it has on retail consumption, it has on car ownership, and so on. And we presented this in government, and they said, oh my God, we'd never looked at it like this before. Because what happens was, if you then take any one of those boxes and any one policy intervention, you realize it's all connected through behavior. It's all connected. And what happens is, if the Treasury, the Economic Department, intervenes on one policy, and immediately it lights up this chain reaction all the way into different subjects altogether, then one ministry's policy can cancel out another ministry's policy because they're both doing opposite things. They don't see how they join together. And if you put in the government departments responsible for those different policies, you realize where the problem is. Government doesn't have a joined up synoptic thinking of what it's doing. It says housing, that's all we're concerned about, without thinking about the other related issues here. We collected lots of evidence, commissioned 45 pieces of work, research projects. We looked at scenarios, because you have to deal with scenarios, and I know economists hate scenarios, but we had to look at scenarios and imagine what the UK would be like in 2040, 2060. And we did this as a very good exercise to do with students, actually, about what the world would be like. And these are mock magazine headlines from 2060, in this case. It's all about location, about the green belt being sacrificed in July 2060, for example, about oil prices rising, so air travel becoming too expensive. So what you do with redundant airport building. This is from 2045. This nice glass shiny building is Terminal 5 at Heathrow, now with a wonderful leisure lake there, because actually it's supplying water to the City of London. So you can be joking around about these things, but they meant to get you to think out of the box, think in a way that you didn't think about before. We've had enough about pollution issues, still not being addressed 2034, and for 2045, the London property market being so expensive that everyone decides to move to Durham and Newcastle in the north of England, okay? Which is what I did, actually, last year. That's a scary thought, isn't it? But essentially, quality of life issues coming into play here. Rational planning responses, economic modelling, behaviour. All plays into this. And if you look at the evidence that we collected, and I'll go through this in a short period of time, we started to play around with actually what the evidence base out there is. Do we have enough land, and what is the land being used for? Well, this was some work done in 2005, 2006, which tried to say, well, how much land is there and what is it being used for? And the astonishing thing was that in England, at this point in time, only about 10% of England is built on. 90% of England is undeveloped. And it comprises predominantly agriculture, as you might guess. Grasses, crops, other agriculture, forestry and woodland. And the biggest change has not been on the amount of housing that's been built over the last 100 years. It's actually the amount of forestry and woodland. That number has doubled in an 80-year period, whereas this number has not increased substantially. So 90% of the UK's population live on 10% of the landmass, crowded in to your cities. So think about what I said before about More people arriving, more people being born, living in cities, more pressure points, while we protect the green belt at all costs. Because that's what we always believed in. And there's a whole huge debate out there about whether that should carry on. There's another interesting statistic, which is 90% of the UK land is owned by 10% of the population as well. And that statistic, I don't think, has changed in about 500 years as well. So we are crowded into small pieces of land. The interesting thing about that is that people in Britain don't recognize that. If you ask them, and this question did, how much of the land is built over, then at least half your respondents say, oh, it must be at least 50, 60%. 50, 60% of the land is already built up, and that's far too much. The figure is 10%. But to them, 50 to 60%. Now, why is that? Is it because we're crowded into urban areas? We're constantly surrounded by concrete? We think we're surrounded by development all the time? Or not? Or is it gives rise, in terms of participation in the planning process, does it give rise to the fact that people say no to everything? No, you're not having a new housing development. No, we don't want a new town designated. No, the developers have had far too much already. So this is what late John Murdoch used to call the preservation paradox in the UK. That people really want to protect every bit of that 90% of space that they can that's currently undeveloped, but ultimately they want more space themselves. They want bigger gardens. They want bigger houses. And they can't see the paradox of what they're saying. Say, no more development. Oh, but for me, yeah, I want that, please. And this drives the rest of the system. This drives the planning system. This drives political and public attitudes to where land is built on for essential services, whether it's housing or other services. The sad fact is, of course, that we're at the lowest rate of house building in the UK since 1923. The red is private sector house building. The grey is the state council housing that came to an end in the 1980s under a certain government that I prefer not to talk about. And what's happened is that it's gone like this over the last 10 years, and last few years especially. And so the private sector didn't meet, if you like, the demand that was there, even in the early 2000s, by the collapse of state housing. Why should they? To create scarcity. But we are at the crisis. We have a housing crisis in the UK. And the degree of affordability now has reached incredible proportions. These diagrams which show England, and the deeper colours are the areas of deemed unaffordability of housing relative to income. It shows you what's happened. In 1999, bits of the home counties around London, which is here, Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, parts of Buckinghamshire, they were the no-go areas for most of us. We could never afford to buy property in this area, and within 7 years this had happened on the same scale. The degree of unaffordability now has even gone further than this in the last 6 to 7 years. The average price of property in London at the moment is €550,000. The average household salary, household income in London is 48,000. It's more than 12 times difference. So hence quality of life, moving out of London as quickly as possible to a different part of the UK or Europe where I can afford a better quality of life than I could in London. That figure is carrying on, worrying trend, dealing with existing demand, let alone long-term population increases as well. We've intervened in certain policy areas. This was a fantastic policy to wave the sustainability banner 10 years ago, where politicians said, we try and build more housing, but we'll do it in brownfield areas. We'll do it in the middle of cities rather than out in the countryside. And that demonstrates that we behave in sustainability. So we had a target that 60% of all new housing should be built on brownfield sites, as it was called, and we achieved it. Fantastic. We achieved it by 2006. 60% of all new housing are built on the old developed sites. The problem was nobody thought of it laterally. And the problem we're facing now is because so much of this was being built in urban areas, there's no space for water runoff in the event of extreme rainfall. So perversely, the unforeseen circumstance of this well-intentioned policy is that more parts of cities are flooding now than ever before, not because we're having greater rainfall, but because the amount of space has been taken up from within cities that was previously undeveloped or derelict, which could drain away the water. So a strange, perverse implication of one policy issue. Population change. This is for the 1990s, which looks like an outbreak of some nasty disease, but it's England, and there's London there, and the red spots are the areas of the greatest population growth through the 1990s. If you did this over the last 10 years, then what it would show is increasing clusters, not in London, because London is unaffordable. The increase in population is going in an arc like this, from East Anglia and Cambridgeshire through the Midlands and Oxford down to the south coast. So you have an arc of growth. That's where the biggest population growth is going on. That's where the biggest demand for housing is going on. And it's in the southeast of England as well. How do you deal with service provision when so much is changing? And just look at this simple diagram of the southeast of England. London is here, the south coast and the east coast. 150,000 people moved in from other countries into London in one single year. 150,000 moved in from elsewhere in the UK. 300,000 people arriving on the streets of London, while 250,000 people moving out. And actually there's a lot of hidden statistics in there that people disappear in London as well. How do you plan for service provision like schools and hospitals and health facilities if you have such a transient population going on? And you're talking about long-term planning to get these sorts of things in place and get the finance in place as well. And what is London doing? Because it is this global world city, it's got more in relation to other world cities around the world than it has to the rest of the UK. What's happening is that commuting is going on over much bigger distances because it's unaffordable to live in this part, this city, Greater London. And I lived about here. And because it's so congested and so expensive and property prices are so astronomical, then people are prepared to move out and commute over much bigger distances. So this map shows, and these lines are commuting lines of one person. This is 1 day's worth of commuting that goes on and around London. Okay, and it's an old one now, it's from 2001. That's the amount of commuting that goes in. People are now embarking on long distance commuting, 1.5, 2 hour journeys plus to work in London, but not have the externalities of living in London, because it's a better quality of life if you can afford property out here. And you change your behavior. You totally change your work patterns. You might use your 2 hours on the train as part of your working day and 2 hours back in the evening if you're still awake at that stage. When I lived in London and I worked in UCL, I was only one of 2 members of faculty out of 30 who lived within London. Everyone else lived way, way away, including one person who was commuting in from Lille every single day because it was cheaper to do so than try and get a similar sort of property in London. And the interesting thing is if you take this diagram off this web and you look at the infrastructure underneath, you immediately recognize the problems, that roads and railways can't cope with the pressure, but also the congestion isn't in just this area. It's actually in bottlenecks much, much greater distance from London itself, at motorway intersections, at railway junctions, as long-term traffic and short-distance traffic collide. And so congestion occurs some distance away. So the effect of London as this world city eating up all the resources then basically is being felt over a much bigger geographical distance than the mere administrative boundary of London itself. I say, I used to live there, which is about 10 kilometers from UCL, as the crow flies, and it used to take me 1 hour, 20 minutes to get into the office to do 10 kilometers. And that's the point where you know you have to move. Put in new infrastructure, but what will infrastructure do? You can deal with issues about how to deal with people getting around Greater London with new tube lines, Crossrail currently being put into central London, which links the airport to the city in something like 25 minutes when it's finished in 2018. Or we can put in more high-speed rail. And there's a huge battle going on in the UK about this bit of it at the moment between London and Birmingham, high-speed 2, and whether it will happen or not. Because if you reduce the commuting time, reduce the journey time, high-speed rail, to unlock the economies of the north and the Midlands, then this might be an hour's distance, then this might become a super commuter zone, rather than actually unlocking the northern cities of the future as well. Concern about putting in more airport. This is the latest proposal of Norman Foster to put a brand new international airport in the Thames estuary, east of central London, which will be linked to high-speed rail, and wonderfully flashy it is too. Major environmental consequence, of course, but that's on the basis that Heathrow, London Airport in West London, is too close to the city, and at peak time at the moment, one plane lands or takes off at Heathrow once every 36 seconds. And concern about whether you put in an additional runway into London Airport, and the current government looking as though it might change its mind and say yes to that if they get re-elected in 2015, God help us. So the alternative proposed by the Mayor of London is that you should have a brand new airport built out in the estuary. But whether it'll be a replacement to Heathrow is another matter. That's how it's been sold, but my hunch is it would be an additional 6th airport for London. Coming to the end, and a part of the project as well, what we did was a series of sieve maps, which is basically we put different issues, different policy issues, one on top of each other to look at the geographical implications. And the civil servants, the public officials we were working with, hated this, couldn't stand it, because they're economists and said there's no need for a geographical perspective at all. In fact, can you not put any maps in your report whatsoever, because they're not needed, they don't show anything. And those of us who are geographically trained, of course, said that's absolutely mad. Of course you have to have maps. But this exercise, what it demonstrates to the southeast of England, there's London, this is 2030, trend-based analysis, and the darker area shows the areas of greater population growth projected in the future. The areas of blue and green are the areas of restraint, like Greenbelt, where you can't build. And we put these blue squares on. And those blue squares are the airports. Strange mix of issues to put on. But the reason we put the airports in, if you look at history, is that's been the biggest land take in the UK over the last 70 years. Not housing, not new town development, but actually airports. Because airports eat up an incredible amount of space. Not just runway and terminal building, but logistics, warehousing, servicing, car parks. And they drive the economies as well. So more and more peripheral office developments, out-of-town retail, warehousing, are all located around these things. So if you're going to have a policy to meet that extra 200 million passengers using your airports in the next 10 years, there's a major space implication of the domino effect it will have on other uses and indeed on demands as well. We also tried to do it in terms of food, agriculture. The darker green areas in this map show our best agricultural land. No surprise that it's around Lincolnshire, the Fens, which are our drained area of the UK, and so the most fertile land you've got. And then these brown areas are the areas of forecasted greatest population growth and housing demand. Oh dear. So you've got in the future greater population and housing demand occurring in the same area, which is our food growing areas. And the government and both different government ministries being responsible for agriculture and housing respectively, carrying on their policies as though space doesn't matter. And clearly there's an implication here. You could do it in relation to flooding as well. This is for 2035, extreme case of rising sea level and the effect it would have. And you can see that, oh bugger, it's the same area of the country that's affected, the food growing area, the area of population growth, which just happens to be the same area that might be susceptible to rising sea levels as well. We don't want to know this, was the reaction from the politician. If, on the other hand, you look at drinking water, it's the opposite. So London and the southeast, the oranges and the reds are the areas under acute stress for drinking water in the future. Whereas the good old west and the north is absolutely awash with rainfall and lots of reservoir. So the demand, remember in this area again, is for more drinking water because of population, because of housing, because of airport policy. Up here, you've got the water. So how will that be regionalized? Will it be regionalized? And how will it be traded as well? Or finally, on energy. On our current trends, this is the extent, this is diagrammatic, the extent of mix of different energy sources that you'll need on current levels. So you need nuclear power, you need wind farms, tidal lagoons, biofuels, which cover most of the country, waste incinerators, pump storage stations and so on, and maybe even clean coal, again, if that comes about scientifically. That's on current usage, okay? And so clearly, we are sleepwalking here into something going on for 2050, that if you carry on with the current demand for energy, this is the mix, the energy mix that you have to provide. And how do you do it? In a planning system which is now increasingly localized, rather than national governments deciding on some of these projects, it's local communities that decide on these projects who perhaps don't see the bigger picture. So I'll conclude on these few slides. What do we find out overall? History matters. History matters. That you need to go back to look at previous interventions and the effect that this had and the legacy it creates. Yesterday isn't immaterial. You have to look at history to look at why we did things in certain ways and then the externalities it creates for us today as well. Politicians have a big part to play. And there's a love-hate relationship in the UK about politicians and they love or hatred the planning. This is Churchill, who said in the war, none of this newfangled planning doctrine in his Victorian-like way. Didn't believe in planning, and it's a sentiment shared, unfortunately, by the current administration as well. They do not believe in planning, long-term planning. Strategic spatial planning has been abolished in England since 2010 because the government ideologically doesn't believe in it. So just when you need these things to be managed, you need a spatial perspective and you need a strategy perhaps, the government removes it because it doesn't believe in it as well. You also have the public. I said behavior, people change in their live-work patterns, the public matter as well. And so any proposal to put in a bit of infrastructure or new development to meet these long-term trends is ferociously resisted by man, women and dogs in several marches that go on periodically about saving our bit of space, saving our green belt, saving the designation, not saving the land, saving the designation. They believe in the green belt that much. That has a major driver of how people react. Politicians can come up with suggestions, planners can come up with suggestions, but politicians might always see their face. The other issue is how we look at the land. So the issue is, this is a plan which shows the route of a new road around the town. And you go to planners and you say, what's there at the moment on the route of this road? And they say, oh, it's okay, nothing's there, nothing at all. And you say, no, it's land. So what's there? And they say, oh, there's no development, there's no building. I said, exactly. So what is it? Oh, it's rural land. It's just fields. You say, yeah, well, those fields provide agriculture, food, water, biodiversity, etc., that the urban area might rely on. Oh, well, planning's all about building. It's all about development. You don't need to look at those things. So looking at things in your own disciplinary perspective is not always the answer. You could look at governance and institution. This is from my colleague Tony Travers, which shows you the family tree of statutory bodies in London alone. This is the number of different government departments and organisations in London that manage London. It excludes the voluntary, the partnerships, it excludes the communities. It is only the statutory bodies. No wonder things don't get done very quickly in London, because you have to navigate through that constant institutional thickness. And planning, well, there's a view that planning is the ultimate, is the perfect model to deal with these issues. And I've come to the realization, of course, that it's not. It bears all the hallmarks of having the perfect specimen, the ideal, but it's a bit more like that. Okay? There are elements of it which are appropriate. There are elements of it which you would never use. And there's bits of it that downright you would ignore on times as well. So planning is not the only solution to deal with the sorts of things I've been talking about. We need to have an holistic sense of how these things come together. It's ridiculous that ministries and academia separates urban from rural, city and its hinterland. We've got to find ways of bringing in environmental science with social science as well, and looking at things in a multifunctional way. So even this picture, what does it show? It's a field? Cereal growing? No. It is a field. It provides water, energy, biodiversity, supports flood risk, and supports recreation as well. So start to look at things in a multifunctional way. If we want all these services in the future, then essentially we have to look at the same space in a diverse way. What added value does a single piece of land provide for us in the future? Think about place-based governance, because all land is unique and all places are different as well. So they have different assets, and those assets can be used in different ways. Now that goes against, if you like, a top-down planning perspective, but there's a hallmark there of something maybe beneficial for the future. Using better resources and better regulation and also taxation, but also incentives as well. So if you deal with the housing problem, then essentially what can be done through the provision of public goods as part of that development process. And planning is not very good at marrying up land management, the market, economics and planning issues. Planners are not very well trained in that. We need new evidence base. It took us 3 years to put this evidence base together, and it came as a sort of shock to those people who are making the critical decisions. Well, clearly we need a better evidence base about combining issues about the land with the sort of modelling for pollution, etc., that goes on at the moment. And I think this is what I'm edging towards, as new tests of spatial resilience. Yeah, I'm using the label as well, jumping on the bandwagon. That really, if you've got to think about how resilient individual places are, then you don't start with sustainable development. You don't start with development. You start with how sustainable the land is, what capacity the land has to change in the first place. Only then do you start thinking about the development on top of that. So sustainable land use is more important than sustainable development. Conceptual thoughts to finish on. The same issues are apparent over long periods of time, but in different degrees, and different things come along to exacerbate them in some way. The problem we have at the moment is that all these things are coming together at the same time, so it can seem wicked problems and quite complex in nature. Intervention through planning alone to deal with these things is outdated, mainly because planners are not the ones skilled to deal with these issues alone. You need to get into bed with other disciplines, with other experts, in order to make sense of what's going on and to think about a managed process in doing so as well. We can have a big conversation about what the land means and our land values. We can have clear objectives, and we can have a recognition of the diversity of places and their assets. And I think that's where academia needs to be going in the future, looking at the uniqueness, the positives that individual places have to offer, but perhaps are not recognized by people within those places. Can we deal with multifunctionality, move to ecosystem services, which I don't always agree with because it's putting a price on non-market goods, dealing with place-based governance, incentives, and evidence-based, and a strategic framework. Not talking about all singing, all dancing, grand blueprint plan. I think those days are gone. But nevertheless, you can have a sense of intelligence and strategic intelligence in order to be able to understand these things. So thank you. You've taken up a huge amount of time. Thank you very much for listening and for coping with some of those complex diagrams as well. And I'll be testing you further tomorrow on those things. Thank you very much for listening.